everyone, and welcome to today's episode. I have been a history buff my whole life, and in all the courses I took in American history and English history and world history, never occurred to me that there was such a thing as a history of animals. So, this is going to be extra fun for me today. We are joined today by Tami Parr, who is the author of Goats in America, A Cultural History. Welcome to the show today, Tami.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks for having me. This is really fun.
Yeah, this is fun. I am so excited. So let's start at the beginning. How did you get interested in goats?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit of a story. I started out kind of in the early 2000s. I started writing a blog called Pacific Northwest Cheese Project. And it was something I did kind of as a hobby back when blogs were kind of cool and before Facebook and everything else, if there was such a time. And I read about sort of the artisan cheese making scene that was happening in the Pacific Northwest. I live in Portland, so Portland, Oregon. The Northwest cheese scene at the time was just exploding, and people were starting small farms and making cheese and all this kind of stuff. So I started writing about that. People asked me to write articles about it. I started becoming the sort of default expert on artisan cheese in the region. And as part of that, I spent a lot of time talking to cheesemakers, talking to goat farmers, talking to dairy farmers, et cetera, time on goat farms and all of that. And I started to become interested in not just the cheese part of it, which is like cheese is like an object and it's beautiful and it's tasty, but also cheese is like the land, the people, the goats, agriculture in general. It's a complex of a whole bunch of different things. And I started thinking about that. And that's kind of what I started to get interested in is like, what is cheese and why do we appreciate it and all that kind of stuff. And that kind of led me down the path to this book eventually.
Awesome. So did you ever own goats or make cheese?
Never have owned goats or made cheese. Yeah. In fact, I often say the more that I know about making cheese, the less I want to do it myself. Expensive, time consuming, hard to market, all that kind of stuff. So it's really the people that have goat farms and make cheese are heroes.
Yeah, I know. Especially those of us who have made cheese know how hard it is to get a really good aged cheese.
Yes, especially aged. Yes, 100%. All of the nuances of the humidity and the storage. And oh my gosh, yeah, it's
Yep.
amazing.
Yeah. So you've written about cheese and dairy for quite some time. You have two books on that
Mhm.
topic. What made you want to write about goats from a historical perspective?
My time in the cheese sort of world or scene or whatever you want to call it, I just started thinking about goats and, what about goats? What is it about goats? When we think of cheese, also milk, we think of cow's milk cheese and cow's milk as milk, the generic term for milk. And I sort of started thinking about goats and it's like, well, why is it different? How do we think about cows and goats differently? So I started just sort of poking around a little bit and looking at old newspaper articles and trying to see what had been written about goats in the past. And once I started to find out how strangely despised goats were in the past, century or two ago, I was just like, whoa, what is going on here? And so then I started digging more and more. And then this whole story came out of the kind of arc or the trajectory of goats and their reputation in America. So I knew I had to talk about that. So
Okay.
here we are, basically.
Yeah. So what
Yeah.
time period does the book cover?
The book really goes back. I kind of cut it off in terms of early American colonies, 1600 to the present. So I kind of just really kind of defined boundaries of the United States or the early pre-United States to present day United States. I think really you could write a multi-volume set on the history of goats. I mean, honestly, from first domesticated animals 10,000 years ago, you could write about so many things in terms of like Greek and Roman Empire. I mean, you could go on and on and on. So I just wanted to kind of keep some parameters around it for making it easy to read. And also that's kind of where we are. This is what I'm interested in is the United States. This is where I live. This is what I know.
So can you
Yeah.
give us a quick overview of the book?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of glib summary is, for many centuries, goats have been kind of used, exploited, persecuted, all kinds of things. But today we have goat yoga and children's parties with goats, baby goats attending them. And so the question I ask of the book is, how did we get here? What happened that we got from negative to positive? How did that happen? Et cetera. And so that's the very, very short summary, but I think it kind of encapsulates a lot.
Yeah. So what are some of the most surprising things that you learned about goats?
Oh, wow. So many things. Oh, my gosh. Like I said, just the intensely negative reputation that goats had for centuries. But also, there's a very key reason why goats' reputation turned around during the 19th and early 20th century based on the health of goat's milk, the perceived health of goat's milk. And so the fact that there was this very defined reason for the the pivot of goat's reputation was kind of fascinating, and that it revolved around tuberculosis and so on. So winds of reputation and opinion change, in any culture, and Americans are no strangers to that. So it's fascinating the way that goat's milk became popular and considered to be a healthy alternative to infected milk. So that was amazing. And then, you get into things like I had not realized how popular goats were on communes in the 1960s and 70s. There's so many great, hilarious stories of goats, people trying to milk goats on communes and so-called hippies, not knowing anything about goats, but being convinced that goat's milk was healthy and trying to figure it out, trying to figure out how to be self-sufficient and use goats and goat's milk for that end. And it's a great period of time just to read about goats, even just that period in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, exactly. I know for people who have no experience with livestock, goats are far less intimidating than cows.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's why that sort of happened. So, and, some people were successful at it. And like Mary Keene of Cypress Grove Chev, she turned it into a business and, was very successful. Jennifer Bice's parents from Redwood Hill Farm, same thing. Some people that worked for, but other people just sort of like came and went on that goat thing.
Yeah. So you've alluded to this a little bit, but is there any particular story that stands out about goats that you want to share with us?
I mean, a couple things are really interesting to me anyway, just because of my cheese background. The early start of the cheese, what I call the commercial cheese industry in the 1980s with Laura Chanel. And a lot of people think that she basically started goat cheese in America. And obviously, she was very pivotal as being in the right place, right time in Northern California. And her partnership with Alice Waters at Chez Panisse kind of skyrocketed the reputation of goat cheese. But there were so many goat cheese makers in the 1970s starting to pop up around Wisconsin, Midwest, Iowa, and even California and so on. And so the way that goat cheese started to trickle into American consciousness, 1960s, 70s, up into the 1980s, is just really interesting. Everybody always talks about Laura Chanel, and she's obviously made a big difference in terms of the popularity of goat cheese, but there was so much more to it than that. I was surprised about that. The other thing that was interesting to me, just another little kind of snippet, is just along with the value of goat cheese and the popularity of goat cheese came things like the urban goat craze. The popularity of urban goats kind of in the early 2000s. A woman named Jenny Grant in Seattle became well known, was written up in the New York Times and so on. She had goats in her backyard in Seattle. They were not legal. She started kind of a legalization campaign, which took off in the press and everyone became excited about it. Eventually, her goats were legalized, but other people in other cities around the country started taking up the urban goat kind of cause. It's really about having the ability to have goats, but also the ability to maybe have your own milk supply, maybe make your own cheese if you want. And, that sort of conversation I think is still ongoing, but very interesting, fascinating.
Yeah. So, as someone who's written a few books, and also I used to be a newspaper reporter back in the 90s, and I
Oh, awesome.
know how hard it is to find
Yes.
sources.
Yes.
And so, this just thinking about the research involved in your book makes my head hurt. And I'm just like,
Yes.
I just think I want to go back to bed when I think about what you must have done. Can you talk a little bit about your research process?
Oh, so much. I mean, it also started pre-COVID. And then when COVID happened, of course, that all shut down. So I had to kind of stop for a couple of years. But it was a really long process. I knew some people in the cheese world just from my cheese background. So I was able to reach a lot of goat cheese folks in the goat cheese community because they knew kind of who I was. But yeah, a lot of it was, there's kind of two prongs. One was just a lot of like emailing and trying to get a hold of goat farmers and cheese people, and some people responded and some people didn't, which I get because it's like, who am I? That nobody knows who I am, which is totally fine. I also did a lot of work in like archives and libraries and stuff, especially for things like I have a chapter in the book about the Navajo Nation. And I visited the Navajo Nation. They have a Navajo Nation archives where there's a whole bunch of oral histories of folks talking about some of the Navajo cheese making traditions with goat's milk and so on. So things like that, I think, especially old pictures from archives and things like that. A lot of papers from the 1920s, which was kind of the 1920s was the time when goat's milk really started taking off. So there's a little bit out there from some of the people who started early goat farms and stuff like that, early ADGA folks. I wish Mrs. Roby, who was one of the first people who started ADGA when it was called AMGRA at the time when it first started, had a collection of papers that would have been a gold mine of early goat history. But things like that are really fascinating, kind of where were people at the time and what did they say and how did they correspond with each other. So that was a big part of it too, in addition to talking to people.
Yeah. So, were there any gaps in the historical records that you found?
I mean, the farther back you go, the less and less there is, especially because in early, like in colonial history and so on, goats were super undervalued. People were not interested in them. So if you're not interested in something, you don't really talk about it. You don't write about it. There's no associations of goat people in the 1600s, at least not in America or what was going to be America, things like that. Whenever there's an association, there's always often an archives. There's a group of people had a bunch of correspondence or something, but things like that makes it harder in the earlier 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. But as you get to the 1900s, people are starting to talk about goats because they've decided that goats are tuberculosis free and healthy and cows are not. So then there's a lot of discussion about it. So it's putting together a puzzle, really, in terms of trying to put this kind of history together, which is both fun sometimes and really frustrating at other times, as you can imagine.
Oh,
Yeah.
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 So, are there any particular lessons that you think modern goat farmers can learn from the history?
We're at such an interesting crossroads in terms of the commercial value of goats these days. Goat meat and goat cheese is really, really popular right now, things like that. For me, the questions that I kind of ended up with that I think that the study of goats kind of lends itself to, or however you would say that, is just sort of, why do we include certain things in history, in what we call history, and not others? Why haven't we talked about goats? Why there's really no history of goats or even articles about the history of goats anywhere. This is it. I mean, now it's out, but why is that the case? Why is it 2025 and that there's nothing out there? And how do we think about how does the cultural memory perpetuate negative stereotypes like about goats? How did that stay true for so long? And why did that change? And how does that work? Those kinds of questions I think are really interesting to me in terms of how we've thought about goats and where we're going in the future thinking about goats.
Yeah. So, in my head, because I have dairy goats, I'm always thinking dairy
Totally.
goats and cheese. How much of the book is devoted to other types of goats, like meat and fiber?
I would say just because of my, involvement with cheese and goat cheese, I would say it's mostly dairy and cheese focused because dairy is the big sort of value of goats right now. There's a chapter about goat meat. Fiber, I didn't talk about as much. Fiber is much less of a value product than it used to be. Late 19th and early 20th century, mohair was the big goat thing, if you will. And so that's huge. I didn't go into that as much just because I can only do so much. One of the things I like to say about this book is I hope that I've suggested things for people to talk about. Like the fiber story is really fascinating and enormous unto itself. I think just because my own trajectory and stuff that I understood and knew about already, I kind of went more for the dairy.
Are goats finally getting the recognition they deserve?
I mean, yes, in some ways, absolutely. I mean, goats are very valuable now. I mean, compared to how they were in the past, goat's milk cheese, goat dairying is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States. Companies are making money off of goat's milk. That's a huge change in reputation. We have goat yoga, as I mentioned earlier. We have the popularity of goats on social media, baby goats frolicking in pajamas, which is a famous video posted by Sunflower Farm Creamery. Goats are very popular in a certain way, but I think there's still a lot of skepticism about goat meat. Some people don't like goat cheese even. I can't tell you how many goat farmers I've talked to who at farmers markets are trying to sell goat cheese. And maybe you have this experience, I don't know, too. And people will say, I don't like goat cheese, and still a little bit of a skepticism, or I don't know how you characterize that. I know people are entitled to their preferences, of course, but I think there's still some wariness about goats, and I'm not sure ebbs and flows of social perceptions are a constant in society, but I think goats are more popular than ever. Will that last? Time will tell. Really, I mean, who knows?
Yeah, exactly. If someone is new to goats, do you think it's beneficial for them to understand the history?
Good question. I mean, if someone is new to goat keeping, I mean, if you're looking to, what breed should I buy, all that kind of stuff. I mean, even that is kind of really wrapped up in history too. I think the reason that we have Alpines and Toggenburgs and Sonnens is because of some of this history in terms of the value of goat's milk as it started to rise in the early 20th century. Does that help you keep four goats, property and so on? Maybe not necessarily and on an everyday practical level. I'm always for context and understanding how we got to a certain place. Why do I do things the way I do them? I think if you're involved in ADGA, there's the whole thing of the American Toggenburg versus I forget the name now, the Toggenburgs that are descended from Switzerland versus the ones that are only, so you're running into some of that history, even just by becoming, if you want to become a breeder of a breed, some of those European breeds like Sonnens and Toggenburgs and Alpines. So you definitely will run into it at some point or another. Will it help you, milk your goats and so on and sell your milk? Not necessarily, but there's a context. Well, actually, even milk sales now are all tied up with some of the big companies that own Vermont Creamery and Cypress Grove Chev and Redwood Hill. And a lot of that is sourced out by French companies. So, the economy of goat products is very tied to history and very relevant to probably your everyday experience if you're going to try to sell goat's milk products. So I guess maybe it is.
Well, I'm a real history nerd, so I frequently find myself telling people historical facts that
Yeah.
most people would say, like, why are you telling me this?
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think it's helpful, like goats are browsers, which is one reason it's been
Mhm.
really hard for us to raise them in the United States.
Yes. Yes.
It's
That's why
like,
they were kicked out of the colonies in the 1600s. They were eating fruit tree bark because goats eat tree bark. Yeah, it's really all relevant.
yeah, exactly. And you could see
Yeah.
why they would think that they were bad. They're
Yeah,
like, we need our
exactly.
fruit trees. So actually, we're
Yes.
we're tying the pieces together here because if I had known that before we got our goats, we might have six more apple trees on our farm right now.
Really? Yeah. Did they just strip them all?
They did, yeah. They were getting out and they stripped the bark from these six apple trees. And it was so sad because the trees were 3 years old. They had just produced their first apples. We were so excited.
Really optimistic. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Oh
then the
no.
goats, we had a little fencing
Uh,
problem with the goats. And
mhm. Bye bye.
yeah. So
It continues to be a theme, I guess.
yeah, definitely. When you set out to write this book, and maybe this changed while you were writing it, but if so, maybe there's more than one answer to this. But what do you hope that readers take away from it?
When I first started out, I think I was just trying to figure out what was going on. And I was very interested in kind of the nerdy facts. But as I started putting it together into the story, I want people to learn about goats in a really sincere way. It's like the story of goats is fascinating, but the story of goats is the story of American history. It's the story of immigrants coming in the 19th century. It's the story of the rise of big goat cheese companies and the economy of goat cheese. It's about small farms in the 60s and 70s. It really is tied up with American history. And I think, I said earlier, what do we include in history? I mean, there's always new things to discover about history. And I think that we understand ourselves better, we understand our world better when we understand all the pieces, really. Goats are a very key piece, whether or not they're valued or not, it just is a fact. They are a very key piece of American history. I hope people can appreciate that.
Exactly. I was really excited after we scheduled this interview and I visited your website. I saw that you had written some books about cheese. So I am really excited about having you back sometime to talk about the history of cheese.
Right.
And so I love the fact that you've niched down to the goats. What are the names of those books in case people want to get a jump start on reading that before we talk about it on here?
And the first one was called Artisan Cheese of the Pacific Northwest. That was written about kind of the current, at the time, artisan cheesemakers of the Pacific Northwest. And the second one was called Pacific Northwest Cheese, a history. So that gets into the history of cheese making and goat cheese making in the Pacific Northwest specifically. This book, Goats in America, there is quite a bit about kind of a broader history of goat cheese and kind of how that got started also in the early 20th century. So yeah, there's a lot to it. Definitely a lot to the history of goat cheese.
Yeah, definitely. So, where can people find you online?
My website is tamiparr.com. My Instagram is at Goat History Book, and I try to post lots of interesting things about goats. On Instagram, I try to post things that I didn't get into the book or that didn't make it into the book, little facts and fun events that are happening and so on. So it's a kind of all kinds of goat stuff. So it's fun. I have fun on there.
Awesome. That does sound fun. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Yeah, like I said, I hope that people really find this book interesting and learn about goats because there's so much to goats, so much more than people think there is. So when I sign books, I always write go goats. So go goats.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. And
Thank
I'm
you,
looking
Deborah.
forward to having a more in-depth conversation about cheese soon.
Awesome. I'm excited. That'd be great.